Well, hey everyone, how you doing? Apparently, I had a little problem here, and I apologize for that because I thought I'd gone live, like a half hour ago. I thought I clicked go live. I saw what I thought was the the stream go, but you guys are like, ah. So really, I'm so sorry. I've been talking to myself for the last half hour. But I'm here now, and thank you for sticking with me, and thank you. I did have everything up, like you can see. So let me do a quick recap. Hey, it's yeah. Hello. I know I've been talking to you guys and like doing stuff and showing you stuff, and it wasn't going out. And it was only because I clicked the link and assumed that it took. Because so what I do is I hit go live, and then I have to hurry up and go to a different window to turn up the intro music. And when I clicked it, apparently it didn't take. I know, isn't that ridiculous? So let me go through everything. Let me just repeat everything I've talked about for the last half hour. Well, it was a rehearsal, right? It was an amazing conversation. It was just an amazing conversation. I was brilliant. Oh my God. I don't think I've been this witty before on camera, so I'm sorry you guys weren't here for it. Well, the thing is, to be on the fly on the wall of me talking to myself is pretty much when it's going out live or not. It's pretty much the same. It does. Hello, everyone. Hello. All right. So, hey, everyone in the chat. Let us start this. I'm just really glad there's not like 30 minutes of music going on. All right. So, first off, because you missed it, I am having a bad hair day. So, hence, baseball cap. If you can't, I can't, doesn't really show up on camera. It's from the artist Token. And I'm waiting for someone to go, oh my gosh, she thinks she's a token, and that's why she's wearing this. Yeah, hey everyone, thank you for sticking around. My gosh, you're here for a half hour with me doing nothing. And the thing was, I was seeing your comments going, so I assumed the feed was going. And then I really looked at what you were saying. All right, let's get started. 4th of July. Who's 4th of July? That's a question I want to ask today, because I don't actually need these at the moment. We'll come back to racism in a second. But yes, when I grew up, the 4th of July for me was, yay, America, freedom, we're cool, and barbecue and fireworks. Because, you know, like when you're 8, that's about where things are set. I thought I got a pretty good education in Wisconsin, and probably relative to others. I did. But now, as I grew older, I'm seeing how much I and everyone in my generation and in subsequent generations just indoctrinated into these norms of centering white people, and centering white people in a way that makes it invisible. So when we say, oh, you know, like Americans got their freedom on 1776, no, Americans didn't declare their freedom. White men declared they were going to take their freedoms away from some other white men, and then everybody else who helped didn't get. I mean, they weren't ruled by a king, but they didn't have any say in their government. They didn't have any legal rights. So we're going to talk a little bit about this. Oh, thanks for saying I feel like a scrub in my baseball cap, but all right. So one of the things I wanted to bring up, and you can see I already played like 2 minutes of this. I'm going to get over it. Is this history of civil rights in the US. And my quibble with this, and first I want to compliment Emperor Tiger Star because they did this work. Yeah, French beret, I have one actually. I should get my 1920s cap. I have a 1920s hat. I should have worn that instead, but it's a little much for July. They have a video here where they document how long it takes for everyone to get their rights in America. And they did this work, I didn't. And I appreciate that. However, one of the things that happens is, one of the things that makes my point. One of their categories here is women's suffrage. And when they mark women's suffrage, the only women who are really voting in these early days are white women. So if you were to do white women's suffrage and everybody else's women's suffrage, they would have to have, you know, 2 different maps. Because women's suffrage didn't help women of color at all in America. So yeah, we are going to, I'm just going to let this kind of run in the background, and to say that this covering language, and I'm using this term, I don't know, I'm sure there's a better term and a more academic term. But what I mean by that is when someone says, oh, Like, I'm going to paraphrase someone I saw on Twitter. Oh, when am I a little bit soft? I might turn myself up a little bit. Just when I see people say things like, I thought when Trump was defeated, Americans would see that he wasn't the cool guy I thought he was, or they thought he was. I'm like, why are you saying Americans when you mean white Americans? I get that there is a portion of the Trump base that is not white. That said, the vast majority of his supporters are white. And those other people are kind of like buying into a worldview that tolerates white supremacy and tolerates that white centering and the normalization of white against everything. Right? That white is the default and everything else is like special, not the base. And how can we deal with the problem if we can't name it? How can we solve the problems of racial resentment and racial bigotries and racial hatred that drives the Trump voter if we don't point out it's their whiteness that they're defending? And by whiteness here, I don't mean their white skin. I mean whiteness as in their cultural superiority. The idea that, Black players have to leave their humanity at the door when they walk into a stadium and not think about how the government affects them and how the state affects them and how their tax dollars go to institutions that oppress them. They can't express support for that, but they have to show support for the flag and the flyover and the anthem of the government that's oppressing them. They are required to do that, but they can't use their rights to say, you know what, I have a different value system. And so this is the kind of stuff, that I feel embarrassed it's taken me this long in my life to really become aware of. And it's because I had the whiteness blinders on. I wasn't to the point where like, I don't see color. But I bought into I'm not racist. So. And that ultimately, if you look at it on a practical level, if you say you're not racist but you don't do anything, you're basically allowing the status quo of inequality to continue. And so the only way to really stand against racism is to be actively anti-racism. Not anti-racist. You can be again against, I think the goal is to get people to let go of their racism. To be anti-racism, to teach values of anti-racism. And, so I'm convinced. I'm absolutely convinced by this argument. All right, so as you can see here, America's not free for a lot of people. For almost all our history. You can maybe argue since the mid to late 1960s, America legally has become a place of universal suffrage, at least. But you say that, we say that, and on the books, it looks good, but then we look at the bills that Republicans are trying to pass. And the bills they're trying to pass are trying to bring us back to this. So, are we even really free when we still have to defend our rights and our freedoms from the same people who are claiming that we're already free? It's just messed up. It's just super, super, super messed up. And so, we aren't, as an American, I'm not celebrating our Independence Day, and I'm not celebrating our freedoms in 1776. We're celebrating white men's freedoms, and they didn't give those freedoms to anybody else for generations. They stood in the way of that. They tried to stop it. It took, even white women, they sleep with white women, right? Well, that's the whole point, isn't it? White women cook their meals and clean their house and raise their kids and take care of them when they're sick and hand over any money they earn because women couldn't, have their own money and property. Until the 1960s, you couldn't have a bank account in your own name as a woman. 1960s in America, until you could have a credit card in your own name without your husband or your father's permission in America. So how free are you when you can vote, but you can't control your own money? And this kind of celebration of freedom it's not everyone's freedom. I think it's worth saying that, because there's a lot of people who suffered under that oppression and a lot of people who fought against that oppression. And it was whites, and it was white Americans out there controlling power, trying to stop it, trying to put the brakes on it every step. And we don't acknowledge that. We take credit for the white people who made things better, and then we don't want to talk about the white people who made things worse. And there's not good documentation on the horrific anti-feminist propaganda. I mean, the documents exist, but there's not like, here are all the whole, it's really difficult to, at least for me, to find a collection of white people being terrible about feminism, men and women. Same thing on racism. You get all these sort of like books on abolition and famous abolitionists. We don't delve into the vile views of the people who were defending slavery and justifying slavery, even though their talking points made it into textbooks in America. My mom had to get hers co-signed by her dad. Exactly. So how free are you? We talk about these liberal freedoms and things like that. Well, the whole point of second wave feminism, which was slightly more intersectional, mostly, I don't want to say only. I think now was pretty forward-looking when it came to issues of intersectionality. Not perfect, because it was still predominantly dominated by, white women's voices in the 1970s and moving forward. But it was better than, actively opposing other people's rights, like we had in the early 19th century feminism. So in terms of those women who wanted suffrage, but not for anyone else except for them. So what I was showing y'all when you weren't here is just another example of how deep and foundational and bedrock racism is in America. And I feel like an idiot every time I come across something and I realize that its roots are racism. It's so similar emotionally to me when I deconverted from theism and the idea and the supernatural, right? When I finally went, this is a load of crap. And the blinders came off, and you see everything again, but through a new lens, like literally a new lens of way of looking at the world and understanding facts and reorganizing them to conform with your new reality, your new understanding of reality. And I always felt so stupid when I would think about the ways I was so gullible in believing things about, supernatural claims and ridiculous things. And I didn't deconvert until my late 20s, yes. And now when it comes to white supremacy, I feel very similar. Like I learn something and it knocks me back because this new piece of information makes me understand in a more profound way how institutionally rotten, corrupt, and rife with, just anti-humanism, anti-human rights, anti-basic valuing, anti-all men are created equal ethos is endemic to everything. We talked about how music has a Western, or how music theory, which is not music theory, it's Western, like 18th or 19th century, 18th century music theory, arose when there was a cultural battle. There's a culture war going on, and someone was trying to contribute to the idea that white German composers were culturally superior to all other people. And that is now the underlying assumption of what people call music theory. These race assumptions are built right in to things that you don't even think are racist. When you're a white person, you don't know these things. Not that people intuitively know what is racist and what isn't racist, but people of color have a self-education process outside of the public school systems, exchanging information and passing on stories, passing on histories that don't get included in white people's history, and at least have more of an access and a framework. Whereas, like me, I was just lied to. So this also is going to, I'm going to, hold on, let me press mute until I get to the timestamp I want. I heard this yesterday, and this is doing it again? Why is it coming out of that one thing? I don't get that. Where's my sound coming out? Should be coming out of my, yeah, just from those speakers. These speakers shouldn't even be on. Okay. All right. This is Andrew Torres and Thomas Smith, who was just on the happy hour the other day, last Friday. And in this little instance, I was absolutely floored. Absolutely appalled. Oh, I'm hearing it in my headphones. Just super loud. Okay. I'm trying to get to minute. Libsyn is terrible for trying to get right to the correct time. Okay. I got you. I got pretty close. This is like about 4 or 5 minutes long. We're going to have a listen to it. Because, yeah. I need to take a drink of water. And so we're going to listen to this while I sort that out.
Case of Johnson versus McIntosh, the Marshall Court had established the supremacy of the federal government in dealing with Native American tribes. So that's how that case is described to the public. Here's what the case actually said. So you had these two guys, Johnson and Graham, and they bought land from the Illinois and the Piankashaw, and I apologize if I'm butchering those names, Piankashaw Indian tribes in 1773 and 1775 in what is now the state of Illinois. And you may know, Illinois was not one of the original 13 colonies. It was organized as a territory in 1809, admitted as a state in 1818. So, this was frontier wilderness.
So what Andrew's doing here, he's just setting up the context for the dispute, which is a land dispute, and it's going to be about some land speculators who bought land from Native Americans. The suit says Indians because because white people weren't able to do geography back in the day. So that gets mentioned just to know he's referencing the old documents, not using that term. Just FYI.
In 1773. So they bought the land from the tribes. At the time, Illinois was the westernmost part of what was claimed by the British Crown as the British province of Quebec. It was ceded to the U.S. government in the 1783 Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War, right? And so then what the U.S. government did was, and I'm not going to be able to explain this in this episode, they patented the land. Just put a pin in that. We'll do it on another episode.
Talk about one weird trick. Okay.
Yeah. And then they said, okay, we got new land. We're going to patent it. And then we're going to grant a portion of that land to McIntosh.
Dang it. I've got this new product idea. It's that exact plot of land. Oh, man, I can't do it. They have the patent. Damn it.
It kind of has some similarity to that. But again, it would be such a rabbit trail.
We won't do it. Someday you'll have to explain that to me.
But here's the thing. That U.S. land patent was the same land that Johnson and Graham bought in 1773 and 1775. Okay. So Johnson and Graham on the one hand, and McIntosh went to court to figure out who owns the land. In fact, Johnson and Graham filed a motion in ejectment to kick McIntosh off the land. And McIntosh was like, wait, the U.S. government gave this to me. And Johnson and Graham said, well, they couldn't have given it to you because we bought it from the Indians before the U.S. government came around.
All right, so again, just really summarize this super quick. While the U.S. was going independent from Britain, land speculators bought land from native peoples. Didn't technically have the permission of the king. There was no U.S. government to get permission from. And so when eventually, we had the Revolution and then we had the Confederacy, and that was a failure. So we had the Articles of Confederation. And that was a failure, so we redesigned it and did a federalist system. Once the Supreme Court was established, the United States government claimed that land and they tried to sell it off to somebody. So people who were bought the land before the government said, we bought it from the property owners, therefore it's ours. And people who bought it from the U.S. government saying, no, we bought it from the U.S. government, so it's ours. That's the core of the dispute.
So the Supreme Court had to decide who owned the land, right? Johnson and Graham or McIntosh? I'm going to eliminate the suspense. The Supreme Court said, well, it's McIntosh because, Indians couldn't really own the land.
Yes. That was the conclusion of the Supreme Court in a 9-0 decision that he is about to elaborate. Native Americans can't own land the same way white people can. I'm going to give you a minute to let that sink in. Because Kevin's still working out his work schedule. Yeah, it's too much time on sports and not enough time on clips. I think part of the also, sorry, there's a little discussion in the chat going on about how the happy hour isn't on YouTube anymore. It's on Twitch, and I think Kevin is probably feeling that because his channel is demonetized, it's not worth putting in the time to put the clips up. I mean, so you can ask him. I personally think it would be good for him to get more exposure, bring people over to Twitch, but yeah. And full-time streaming, I can tell you, like, although it is, there is prep time and there is time on air, you got time to edit videos. Yeah, you really have time to edit videos. So I don't think he's worked it into his work schedule. I think he might get mad at me for saying it, but he can't say it's not true.
So whatever Johnson and Graham bought was not land, and here's why.
I mean, note you've been speaking in the old-timey sense, by the way, just from the case, from the actual case, right?
Correct.
Okay.
So first, the Supreme Court said Native Americans couldn't actually own property in the Lockean sense, right? And that is the idea set forth in the two treatises of government, that you mix your labor with that which is unowned and thereby come to own the entire thing. Because the Native Americans didn't construct permanent structures, right?
Oh my God.
And by the way, this is why you get that like kind of noble, savage, use every part of the buffalo, live in commune with the land stuff in American history textbooks, particularly the younger that it is, because that ethnographic stereotype played into the legal reasons why it was like,
really?
Yeah, well, yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. Because they're not building buildings the way Europeans build buildings, they're not really transforming the land. It's still kind of public land.
So they...
Do you believe this? Do you believe this? So, Native Americans did do agriculture. They understood the idea of cultivation of land. I know there's a story about how they taught the white invaders from Europe how to use fish as a natural fertilizer to give nutrients. Maybe that's not even true, but that's what I understand. And yeah, so you can be on the land. You can basically walk across it and use it for centuries. You can do whatever, but unless you are exactly like Europeans, you don't really, that's not your land. Someone could just come and take it from you. And if they do a special thing of putting up a wooden frame, now it's suddenly magically theirs because they're white and they did a building on it. Literally, this is it. Native Americans can't own property in the same Lockean sense as white people. And as a consequence, white people are free, while white men, because of course white women own land, white men are free to steal it out from under them. This was our Supreme Court. This was a 9-0 decision. And this is not taught in law schools. This part of it is whitewashed. This racism is covered up with legalese to make white men feel better about legalizing theft. That's what's happening. All right. I'll just continue playing, but I'll make the point because I watched a lecture on this, and the guy completely whitewashes all of the racism out of this case.
They can't possibly own land or have any claim to it.
So let's parse that out.
Okay.
The Supreme Court didn't say they couldn't have any claim to it. They just couldn't have full ownership in the way that Western Europeans do. And if you
This is opening arguments, and there's no real text to show you. I can bump this up. I'm happy to make it a little bit easier to read. But yeah, this is from opening arguments. They have 2 episodes on critical race theory. The first one is called Opening Arguments 501, Critical Legal Race Studies and Critical Race Theory. And this is part 2, why critical race theory is indispensable. Just FYI, opening arguments. They also have a Twitter account that you can.
You think I'm putting a gloss on it? That is the precise language from the opinion that I'm about to quote in a minute. So Indians had a right of occupancy, but did not own the property in fee simple, right? Which is to say all of the rights that come along with property.
You and your ancestors might have been on this land for generations. The original peoples, you might have wholly sites and burial grounds. But when the white man shows up, it's his. You see, when the white man shows up, he has a right to claim it because you haven't done something he does, and because everything is good when white people do it. If you aren't exactly like the white people, well, you don't have a claim. This isn't your land. I can't even with this. And yeah, we're gonna get onto it more.
Okay. And then, and again, I'm going to quote directly from the opinion. When, quote, the great nations of Europe, end quote, discovered this, quote, uninhabited continent, quote, the character and religion of its inhabitants.
Did you hear that? Because Thomas is going to have the same brain meltdown you do. An uninhabited land with inhabitants. That was the Supreme Court writing those words one right after the other. And a 9-0 decision. This is how racism rots your brain. This is how racism makes you less human in terms of your compassion and your ability to relate to other people. It's a block.
Right? That is to say, the indigenous people living here.
Does it really say uninhabited,
it
comma,
does.
The character and religion of its inhabitants?
It does.
Did I hear you correctly?
You heard that correctly. So the character and religion of its inhabitants afforded an apology for, that is an argument, for considering them as a people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim an ascendancy. Yeah. So...
superior genius of Europe can claim an ascendancy. That was a Supreme Court decision. That has not been overturned. I think it's not like, it's still within the law. It's not like it's been removed, right? This was their, this isn't objective legal analysis. This isn't rationalism. This isn't fairness and equality. This isn't, all of those Enlightenment principles. This is justifying racism. This is white people justifying land theft from people who aren't white. And that was the law of the land. How is that free? How is that liberty?
Again, this is further in the opinion. By bestowing on them civilization and Christianity, right? That's a direct quote. The argument was that the colonizing nation adequately compensated the natives for taking away their right of occupancy on the property, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, you don't own the land because you're not building factories. You just have a right, but you do have a right to live here. We're recognizing that. But we've compensated you for taking away your right to live here because we've given you the benefits of civilization and Christianity.
Oh, my God.
So, therefore, only colonizing nations from Europe have a right to own property, have an original right to own property in the United States. That was called the right of discovery.
Yep.
And it was confined to countries, quote, that it excluded any other claims, quote, then unknown to all Christian people, end of quote. Okay.
Don't tell me all men created equal isn't anything but white men being dropped out of it. I mean, honestly, there was no all men are created equal in the 1700s in America, or the 1800s in America, or for a lot of people in the 1900s in America. They say the words, they don't mean the words. They say the words, they don't mean the words they're saying. Or, we have to put an asterisk next to it saying, racism reduced who they thought were humans to white. And I think some of them doubted women were. They certainly didn't treat them legally like people. So the whole myth about, that the idea that myth of living with the land, being one with it, consuming everything, living in harmony with nature, that was put upon the cultures by white people. So seeing Native people through a white lens and trying to distinguish their occupancy of the land from white people building houses comes out of this decision, and it's used to justify stealing people's land out from underneath their feet. I mean, it's one of those things. I always feel like such an idiot when I come across something that is rooted in racism, and I didn't know. When we looked at the video of music theory. It is not music theory. It's music theory of white European men in the 18th century. And yet it's treated as universal. It's treated as objective. It's treated as a theoretical way to analyze all music, when the scales are tilted toward favoring the aesthetic of white people who lived in, German-speaking white people in the 19th century. What? Like, you're not even, there's not even like an explicit explanation, of, like, it doesn't come with a warning. There's no warning labels on racist cultural things. Oh my gosh, like, I should look into the racism behind my belief that Native Americans live in harmony with the land. I mean, whether or not they do is kind of beside the point. That this became a piece of white propaganda to justify the idea that Native Americans can't really own the land that they're on. Only white people can do it, because white people do the white Lockean thing of putting up a wooden frame. And anything else you do doesn't matter. It's that one thing that white people do that you don't do. Notice that they mentioned buildings. They didn't mention agriculture. They didn't mention burial sites. They didn't mention holy places. They picked the one thing that separated sort of like the physical structures of Native peoples, and like, oh yeah, that's it. Like, oh, you got to build a house. You got to build a house to own property. I mean, who cares what Locke said about mixing your labor, and, like, anything you mix your labor with, presumably, Locke doesn't limit it to houses. But these people, what these guys did, because it helped them legally justify straight up theft and genocide and moving, Native peoples onto reservations and then breaking treaties with them because they didn't really count. They weren't really. And they celebrated 4th of July every year like they were proud of themselves. White people did in those times. So we have to be honest about this if we're going to get over this. And it's time for, I feel that all the white people in generations past have passed on this, passed on owning this stuff. And, I'm beyond caring whether or not it's fair that I have to take ownership for generations of white racism. Someone has to, and we have to start now. We can't keep making these excuses. We don't have a land of liberty and justice for all, and if we keep pretending like if we just deny black athletes the right to kneel, to point that out to us, we are never going to solve the problem. Damn, huh? Not exactly the 4th of July celebration other people were expecting. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about. Oh no, all right. Because of time, I'm gonna skip this. I'll do this next week. All right. But there was a really good article that was just published in APSR. Now, the American Political Science Review is a pretty good journal. I don't know exactly what its impact factor is, but it's up there. APSR is a good journal, and one of the authors said that, word count means, and journals have very strict word counts. You think 7,000 words is a lot, it's not. You think 10,000 words is a lot, it's not. When you actually have to tick all the boxes in a journal article, and you do your literature review and your citations and your theory and your blah 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 blah, and then you do your results and all your other tests, and sorry, 10,000 words is not a lot. But this is the thing that Lillian Mason here has written, that she wants to point to, that this thread is designed to unpack. Finally, this research reveals a wellspring of animus against marginalized groups in the United States that can be harnessed and activated for political gain. Trump's unique ability to do so is not the only cause for normative concern. Instead, we should take note that these attitudes exist across both parties and among nonpartisans, though they may remain relatively latent. When leaders and parties draw attention elsewhere, the right leader can activate these attitudes and fold them into voters' political judgments. Should America wish to become a fully multiracial democracy, it will need to reconcile with these hostile attitudes. And we're talking about white resentment. resentment here. Like this is where the core of the problems in America when it comes to inequality exist. It's not in the Black community, not in Hispanic community, it's not in Asian American Pacific Islander community, it's not in the gay community. Like it is, although gay white people can be the problem, but it is the problem is white. So yes. For big problem with Christians, white evangelical Christians. I'm looking at you. Is y'all have a history, like the most racist history in all of America. The new MAGA anti-MAGA conflict is not an entirely partisan one. It is about white Christian supremacy versus a fully multiracial democracy. And I do think that this is important because it points out this isn't just about race, it's also about religion. And it's much more difficult to get white supremacy out of faith, I think, than it is to get it out of laws. Because at least, we've seen the civil rights movement, it took a long time, but eventually public pressure and public opinion can force a policy change. But what can force the Southern Baptist Convention or conference or whatever they are to not be our racist AF? They're a self-selecting group and they've got religious freedom protections, and so public opinion won't push them. So, I mean, it's a serious threat. Like this combination of racism, of white supremacy and faith, Christian faith, is the biggest threat to our democracy. And the thing is, okay, it was fine when only white men had rights, but ever since we've tried to expand that out, it's white Christianity, white Christians who are the problem. All right, so here's a nonlinear relationship between Trump support and animus toward Democratic groups. And as you can see here, that the animus towards Democratic groups go up when you look at people's favorability ratings toward Trump. And we're looking at 2018 and they're doing like multiple years. You didn't hear that? What was that? All right, I'm going to keep going. It's not happening for anyone on the Democratic side. Oops, let me go back. And this is important, and I retweeted this, and I'll maybe talk about this with Kevin too. Hating Christians and white people doesn't predict favorability toward any Democratic figures or the Democratic Party, right? So this is an anti-white racism. Empirically, they've demonstrated this. This is not a both sides thing. This is definitely, like even if you don't like Christians and white people, it doesn't predict your attitudes toward Democrats the way that hating non-Christian whites will predict your attitude, your favorability ratings of Trump. Oh, I whispered something in the mic. What did I whisper? Oh, it was always white racist Christian people that were the problem in America. There, yeah, I turned the microphone, I think, away so that you couldn't pick up so much of my background noise. But yeah, it's always been white Christians in America that caused the problem. What was it? Okay. The current control of the GOP makes it seem like a partisan issue, but this faction has been around longer. Okay, I'm just gonna go through this, right? From Liliana, because she makes excellent points here. This means that there is a faction in American politics that has moved from party to party, can be recruited from either party, and responds especially well to hatred of marginalized groups. They're not just Republicans or Democrats. They're a third-party faction that targets parties. This is the faction we, as Americans, should be worried about. I'm gonna give you membership of this group. James Lindsay, Chris Rufo, PragerU, Dennis Prager, the Koch brothers, Alex Jones, anybody like in that circle, this is who she's talking about. They're not, they ally with the GOP, but they're not partisan in that way. They care about protecting white culture from having to share space equally or respect other people. So she goes on to write, "This is the faction we as Americans should be worried about. Bipartisanship is not the answer to the problem. We need to confront this particular faction of Americans who have been uniquely visible and anti-democratic since before the Civil War, when they were Democrats." This is the core, this is the point. It's not just about party, although party is correlated. This is just racist white people who hate other people not wanting to give up any of their privileges. And whether they were defending slavery or defending segregation or defending anti-First Amendment, bills on restricting what can be taught at universities, they don't care about freedoms. They care about their status and power. He is a Nazi. Yeah, well, Nazis are in this group too. Okay. We haven't really talked about them except in extreme and isolated ways, like talking about the KKK. But Trump served as a lightning rod for lots of regular people who hold right Christian supremacist beliefs. We neglect to name and identify them at the perils of democracy. Mrs. Milwaukee, white Christian supremacist. Absolutely. And it might not be about Christianity, the beliefs, but it is about the Christian culture. They associate that white Western Christianity as with, superiority, normalcy, what America is. And anything that deviates from that is a threat. Acknowledging that is a threat. Making space for that is a threat. Their current control over the GOP makes it seem like a partisan issue, but this faction has been around longer than our current partisan divide. True facts. I mean, they are facts, so they are true. And calling it partisan is a misdirection, even if it is facially true. I think this is super, super important. It's not, how do I want to say this? The GOP does evil things. The GOP does evil things because the people inside of it are promoting evil things, but it isn't synonymous. So if you just call it Republican, you're going to end up getting people who, you're going to include people in that categorization that don't meet this. I mean, I think there is a really good case for a small government pro-racial equality argument that sees any allowance of institutional or systemic racism as interfering with people's ability to pursue life, liberty, and happiness and meritocracy, which isn't a thing, but people want it to be a thing, right? So I think that there is a completely compatible small government in terms of Republican, right? You don't think it's small government, but it's small government in that you need enough government. Well, we're going to talk about that, but I think you can have an ideologically compatible argument. And saying GOP again covers this up, making it look like it's a left-right thing when really it's a problem with white Christian supremacy. And they can exist anywhere. They can be in Bernie's movement, or they can be in the other parts of they can vote for local Dems or whatever else. And that, not GOP so much, but that is the problem. And the GOP are using that to get political power, which makes them evil. This current research, it draws our attention away from the faction and forces us to both sides, democracy and anti-democracy. These two sides are not equivalent. And academics and journalists who are pressured into non-partisanship, it makes it difficult to speak honestly about the threat. I'm going to retweet that because I see this is how European values of objectivity are legitimately questioned. When it comes to doing science, when it comes to applying the scientific method to questions, to answer them, I'll say it that way. This idea, that is imported from the natural sciences about neutrality and objectivity doesn't make sense when you put it into social sciences where values are so important. And the idea that we can just treat fascism and democracy as equally valid options for our country to use as a form of government is holding ourselves hostage to that European white notions of objectivity, because that's where they were formulated, right? And that's what they're associated with. It's okay to call fascism evil as a normative stance. That doesn't threaten science. It doesn't change the numbers, All right. So, but this that this current research locates the faction in 2011 and observes them moving toward Trump by himself in 2018. So it's a panel study. From across the political spectrum, Trump solidified the faction's control over the GOP, but they are not loyal to the party. They're loyal to white Christian domination. Right? And this explains why Trump has higher support than Kevin McCarthy. Because even though they're like, yeah, you know, you're on kind of Team Trump, you're not Trump, but what we really like is Trump. We really want someone to go out there and just tell us how good we are and how evil everyone else is. Also, we're not racist. This is true but uncomfortable conversation we need to start having. It may seem uncivil or rude. It may break the norms of objective reporting and research. But these rules and norms have always protected this faction. That's the point. This is like when people say, oh, you know, critical race theory and other forms of critical theory, they question the very foundations of objectivity and neutrality in science. Like, well, should political science treat fascism and democracy as equally valid forms of government? Because that's what you're asking, that's what you're demanding. And when you do that, you normalize fascism. As long as they can hide behind party labels and are protected by bipartisanship and the both sides implication of polarization research, it's time to bring this faction out of the protection of party labels and the veil of political civility and into the discussion. Again, this is like a really important article. I am going to retweet out the entire thing so you can check it out on Twitter. I'm going to leave it in my bookmarks because I think Kevin and I should discuss this. It's, you know, again on the Twitch channel and get this more exposure and get these ideas out there. Alrighty dighty. Part 3. Hey, do you remember when I said I was going to do like 3 different things in a show? I'm trying it out this week. How do you like it? First, we did the critical theory thing and civil rights, and now we're looking at this study about what the real problem is in America, which isn't necessarily the GOP per se, but white Christian dominionists or white Christian domination proponents, or people called those. Okay. So the last thing that I was going to do today was, all right, we're going to talk a bit. I realized I hadn't finished up on, I'll big there's nothing else for you on camera. I'm just going to do it for like 10 minutes and then get going. I am so randomly lit. I don't know. I guess it kind of gives the shape, right? Like I'm supposed to have depth. We talked 2 weeks ago, because I took last week off, about historical epistemology and structural Marxism. I think, left off at Althusser. That's how I'm going to pronounce it from now on. And I looked at this morning and went, oh God, I can't summarize this. I just can't. So I'm going to just read this out. So apologies. I'm literally just going to read out a book too. But before I do that, I want to have a glass of water. So I'm going to mute myself for a quick second while I take a drink. All right. Let's talk about the developments in structural Marxism and later, in the 1960s, I guess. All right. So we're talking about the epistemological break that was occurring, and Benton and Crabe go on to write. Key features of this approach, and this approach, I think, is the epistemological break that they're talking about from, I'll just read. From this approach were carried forward in France by Louis Althusser and structural Marxism, and by the post-structuralist Michel Foucault. In a series of articles written during the 1960s, collected in English as a translation, Althusser made use of the concepts of problematic and epistemological break in an attempt to relaunch Marxism as a creative scientific research program. I don't need these anymore. After decades of orthodox subservience to the policy requirements of the Communist Party leaders, he and others provided a close textual reading designed to show the emergence of a new scientific problematic in the study of history in Marx's work after 1845. This implied that the humanist mark of the early texts, which were currently influential in Communist Party circles, belonged to the ideological prehistory of Marxism. Then began an extensive work of defining and collaborating and elaborating the concepts of the scientific Marx, and making use of these ideas in the analysis of media communications, youth culture, education, anthropological studies, third world development, gender divisions, and so on. But Althusser and structural Marxists faced a particularly difficult problem. Like their predecessors, the historical epistemologists, they emphasized the gap between ordinary common sense thought, or ideology, and genuine science. The radically egalitarian student movement of the 1960s was quick to point out the potentially elitist and undemocratic implications of this insistence on the distance between quote-unquote science, the possession of a small coterie of self-styled intellectuals on the left, and ideology, the allegedly inadequate and defective beliefs of the masses whose benefit the science was supposed to serve. I just want to tie this in a little bit to what was so important about critical race theory and its contributions, its indelible contributions to the field, is that it pointed out that the way that legal studies were being taught was always from the side of the victors. It was, legal documents and court decisions and filings and whatever. But Native American peoples didn't have, for instance, a law library where they wrote down all their things. They had oral traditions, or they had other ways of preserving that information that wasn't counted as valid. They had individual stories and experiences that was firsthand direct knowledge of the events, but that wasn't considered evidence. And this was also similar to a critique that was happening with feminism toward the natural sciences, this idea that you're dehumanizing people when you treat them as experimental subjects, and that there's a moral obligation for the researcher to relate to other human beings on a human level, which wasn't being done in a Western normative, the Enlightenment normative approach to science, which just treats people like objects. And so validating the idea that there is information key to our understanding, it's just not presented to you in a way that you're used to seeing, doesn't mean that that information isn't valid. And so I think that this is, it's one of the attacks that people who don't understand the idea of having, they buy into science is objective and neutral and, has to qualify, and personal stories are just bias. Personal stories contain knowledge, direct knowledge, firsthand knowledge. And is it generalizable to a population? No. But you can't take a survey value, a mean for a population, and say anything but one person's life. So the question is, do you want to homogenize all human beings and just sort of wash out all the variation in order to get something, like a number? Or do you want to do the work and get that human experience and people's, it's their memories, but this is the stories they tell themselves and the stories they pass on. You can link it back with newspaper articles and, verify it in other ways, but to just dismiss it is irrational as a science. Okay. I need to not comment a lot because I want to get through this. Although he radically revised his views, Althusser never resolved this problem in a satisfactory way. However, his earlier writings were significant for his distinctive way of thinking about science as a social practice of a quite special kind. For Althusser, science was a practice of social production of knowledge, in which the key role was played by the theoretical problematic of the science concerned. On this model of science, the theoretical concepts making up the problematic are employed as means of production of new theoretical concepts by transforming conceptual raw materials, which might be ideas produced prior to theoretical practice, which might be ideas produced by prior theoretical practice, or drawn from the wider culture, and so on. This model opens up the possibility of sociological explanations of the content of scientific knowledge, but without giving up the notion of scientific objectivity, unlike most other constructionist sociological approaches. And that's what I was just going to say, is that the problem Althusser is having that I see in this is that, yeah, it's trying to fit qual into quants. It's trying to say, okay, we have quants, we have science, how do we fit qual into it? Instead of saying, oh, okay, qual is a whole field of its own. It's got value on par with these, it's like, it makes contributions independent of science. It doesn't have to be a handmaiden to it. In effect, Althusser's approach wields the insights of the historical epistemologist together with the realist and materialist legacy of the Marxist tradition. In his terms, theoretical practice produces knowledge in the form of thought objects, which, in the case of science, correspond to real objects whose existence is independent of and external to the process of producing knowledge of them. However, Althusser never succeeded in solving the problem of how, in science, it is ensured that this correspondence really does hold. Unless this could be done, the crucial distinction between science and ideology could not be. Post-Althusserian sociology of knowledge and culture tended to accept that this problem was insoluble, and as a consequence moved toward analysis of language and cultural processes in abstraction from epistemological questions of truth, falsity, or reference to a real world independent of people's beliefs. As we will see in Chapter 10, much of the work of Michel Foucault takes this form, as does the work of post-Marxists such as Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, who, by the way, Laclau and Mouffe were at Essex, weren't they? I think I walked past their offices. When I was at Essex, they were associated with the department. Laclau. Yeah, founding figures. Ernesto. Yeah, so Ernesto Laclau served since 1986 as a professor of political theory at the University of Essex. So I used to walk past their offices, and of course these guys also taught at Essex, so they would have known them personally, probably. I'm sure. It's just kind of weird to me, like when I started to read of like published works, and I knew the people they were citing, or I'd met the people they were citing. That was a very weird point in my life. Where was I? Ah, yes. However, there were some who attempted and held on to Althusser's project to combine together with the model of science as a social practice of production of knowledge with a realist understanding of knowledge as almost something independent of it. The critical realist approach, first developed in the early 1970s, tried to do this, to find ways of solving the problem Althusser had powerfully posed. Central to the critical realist case was the use of transcendental arguments in relation to a range of scientific practices. A transcendental argument is one which takes as its premise an uncontroversial or undisputed description of something actual, for example, scientific experiment, and then poses the question, what must be true for this to be possible? In the case of scientific experiments, Roy Bhaskar, the most influential critical realist philosopher of science, demonstrated that only if the external world existed and had certain properties, and only if human agents had certain abilities to intervene in that world and monitor the consequences of doing so, could there be anything recognizable as experimentation. These arguments offer a convincing way of combining together an understanding of science as a historically changing and socially situated human practice, with an acknowledgement of it as distinctively a social practice whose aim is the production of knowledge about objects, relations, processes, and so on, which exist and act independently of our knowledge of them. However, Althusser's own search for guarantees of our knowledge corresponds to its external. His search for guarantees that our knowledge corresponds to its external objects is decisively abandoned. Sorry, there's those stupid little fruit flies that come up in the summer, and there's one annoying. So accepted science. Sometimes these sentences I don't know where they're going when they start. External objects is decisively abandoned. Science is displayed as rational inquiry into the nature of an independently existing reality, but also as one whose products, currently accepted scientific knowledge claims, are always personal provisional and subject to modification or rejection in the face of future evidence and arguments. It is only, realists argue, if we recognize science as making knowledge claims about independently existing realities that we can make any sense of what it is for a belief to be shown to be wrong. While appearing to be more modest in its claims, relativism turns out to be a way of insulating beliefs from refutation. Some of the most basic intuitions underlying realist approaches are derived from the experience of getting things wrong, of making mistakes, and being, sometimes painfully, reminded of this by reality. We'll return to the discussion of this approach and its implications for the practice of social science. Okay, I didn't know how to summarize that on PowerPoint. I just didn't. Absolutely did not. So I hope you enjoyed Christy's reading hour, or at least reading 15 minutes. And next time, the next section is Kuhn and the revolution of scientific paradigms. So we will have a look at that then. All right. I'm going to give you all a second. I can bring it back to the other thing here. Because there you go. I don't really have much to show on this side. I'll tell you what, I can promote this. I'll give you guys a couple, if you want a few minutes to write down some questions. Otherwise, that is going to be the show for today. Sorry it was late. Again, I really thought I started the stream, honest. But at least for those of you watching in the past, you didn't have to wait with the music opening for the first 5 minutes. So thank you all y'all who went, "Where are you, Christy?" and finally got my attention. I just thought you guys were having your normal daily. No one else seems to be typing, so I'm going to assume that y'all fell asleep to the sound of my voice or have moved on with your lives. I'm going to get going. I'm going to get ready for some D&D tonight, and I will be back next Sunday. So then I guess I can transition back here to say that, yeah, all that's left to be said is that I've been Christy. You've been awesome. Have a wonderful Sunday, wherever it is, whenever it is you are. Be safe, be well, and we'll see each other again really soon. Yeah, next time I'll remember to start the stream. Bye, y'all.